All right, so welcome everyone to our High Council meeting number 5. We have a pretty good turnout as far as our High Councilmen are concerned, and we also have my co-developer and partner Calandial as well. And so we recently released version 0.2 for the general populace, and I thought it would be a good idea if we use that opportunity to go over some of the new things we have in Songs of the Eons, as well as where we go from here as far as development is concerned, in lieu of a lot of chaos happening in the world, and how we plan to adapt around that. So first, I thought it would be good to mention basically what Songs of the Eons 0.2 brings to the table. Since 0.1, obviously we've had a lot of extra stuff added. Everything from things like bedrock to soils to complex erosion patterns, updated climate, vegetation, snow, soil moisture, all kinds of good stuff. And as you can see here, we've also added a much better real life map mode that shows you what the world looks like from space, including which basically reveals the underlying bedrock of a given environment, plus the soil that happens to be there, plus the vegetation and snow and things like that. So lots of cool stuff added. And so now at this point, Calandial will be moving ahead with a variety of different gameplay mechanics to layer on top of these layers of simulation. So with that, I think we can open up the floor to some questions or discussion topics from anyone in our High Council, if they are interested.
I guess I shall begin.
I had a feeling it would be you.
You may be surprised to know that I have a list.
Thank you for being
here. Okay, so my first question is about wind speed. At the moment, it's static, and I know that it's supposed to be an important part of ecology. So my question is, at what point do you plan to implement that in the way that would be dynamic, changing from season to season?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there's a number of things we need to do to tune climate. And so the importance of wind, why is wind important? Wind basically influences the effect of water moisture in a given area, right? So areas that happen to be really strongly windswept, not only will it tend to blow down trees more and make things like grasses and shrubs more competitive, but then it also removes the little humidity bubble that exists around leaves, and so they lose more water through their stomatas, right? And so, yeah, we want to be able to capture that, the disturbance effect of winds, as well as the negative influence it has on water, because you have some areas that are virtually tropical, but then the wind is so consistent and persistent that it makes it almost more like an arid area as opposed to someplace that's tropical. As to when we would get better information and have it vary kind of from season to season, Calandial, do you have anything to add there?
As to when, I think this year. I'm not sure when exactly, because the current plant model actually doesn't rely on wind information that much, so I haven't updated it yet. But when we start having preliminary gameplay, we'll go back to this game system.
Okay.
So maybe towards the end of 0.3, if I had to give a concrete date.
Yeah, and we'll persistently be updating, the underlying systems here and there as is necessary. Does that answer the question?
Sure, yeah. I'm satisfied.
All right. Anything else?
I was thinking, so when's the next thing going to be for the Patreon democracy group thing? Because like the last vote we had was to vote on the name of the High Beavers back in September And in fact, I think that's the only thing we've ever done there.
Yeah, we need to. It would be nice to kick off to have some votes of more consequence, but but not something like it's tricky because you want to make sure that you have the adaptability to kind of change course when necessary in development when you kind of run into new issues, but you also want to be able to do right by the patron tier. And so if anyone as these things come up and people come up with ideas for things that they can vote on which they think is of some consequence but not going to sort of nail us into a corner on development, and that's it's always welcome. But part of this, we'll talk about how challenging the past year has been and how it's been more difficult to engage with followers and fans and things like that a little later in the meeting. But we can elaborate more on that topic when we get to it at that point. So I'll bring that point back up, a typical name, when we get to that segment of the meeting. Sorry, I can't give you something better right now.
I, for one, approve autocracy.
Is there anything more related to 0.2 for now, and then we can get to some of the other sort of development strategizing type of stuff later, and community engagement around the second half maybe.
I have a question if that's all right.
Mm-hmm. Go for it.
So the resource distribution map at the moment looks really random to me. Shouldn't it be more concentrated on pattern, kind of like the volcanism map at the moment, where more resources are in regions with old crust like cratons or shields?
Right.
The way it works right now is that it also shows you certain minerals which are pretty much useless economically speaking. I use data from Dwarf Fortress to determine frequency of minerals from different rock types, and because of that you have things like macro lines splattered all over the world, which make it look like resources are uniformly distributed when they really aren't. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So, question: if the do certain because I haven't personally coded the resource map mode, but would we have a different outcome if we were able to kind of evaluate different resources on the map mode, right, as opposed to kind of just the
I need to go back to that map mode and split things like gems and metals into different categories, because right now it's all splattered on the same
Right.
layer. So you have things like microcline and sandstones on that map mode, alongside things like galena and hematite, which are probably more centered in volcanic mountains and such,
right.
and less so in sandstone plains.
Okay. Yeah. Does that help answer the question?
It's perfect.
So, next question.
Next.
Yeah, I wanted to wait, give other people time to speak, but I guess if no one else has anything to say, I do.
got one.
Please go ahead.
Alright, so what tools will the players have to interact with the ecology? And for some historical examples, we have the Romans that planted a lot of trees in North Africa to prevent soil erosion, which would have an indirect effect on the climate. And then secondly, there is the Battle of the Yalu River in 612 in Korea, where they purposely dammed the Yalu River and flooded a Chinese army of 300,000 men and destroyed them.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a couple of, there's a multitude of ways that really a society should be able to be interacting with the environment. There's kind of the macro effects, right, where depending on how you use the land, you cut down trees, you till deep-rooted grasslands too aggressively, stuff like that, and then you create long-term degradation effects, which can have wide-ranging consequences, like changing the local climate, right, in the long term. Those are kind of the big ones, right? And then you have the smaller types of local interactions, like you have a lot of grass in an area due to a conspiracy of conditions, and so you have grasslands which are favorable toward large grazing animals, which specific people can develop lifestyles around, either as hunting large amounts of wild game, or having an agrarian lifestyle of herding, because you have a lot of wide open range and fast growing grass to graze your animals on, but not necessarily, you may not have a river going through the area which you can use to easily irrigate plants as competitively, right? And so those are the kinds of ways, on a local level, that you would see the environment influencing your society, right? So if you, and not to mention different types of vegetations will grow up to produce different levels of organics, right? So if you, once again, are in a forest or a grasslands, you're going to have way more organics having built up there. And so any society moving in there and using the soil is going to have that sort of savings account of organics that they can draw on. Whereas if you have an area with mostly dominant shrubs, there's going to be very little organics in the soil to draw upon, and they'll degrade very, very quickly. And so the kinds of lifestyles that you can have on an area that's had shrubs for 1,000 years is going to be different than something with grass for the past 1,000 years. And so you can probably farm for a while in some nice grasslands or some recently deforested forests or something like that, but you'd have a much more difficult time. You'd be stuck with herding mostly in a lot of scrubland that didn't have a river going through that you could irrigate off of. And so you'd basically need technology to overcome the kind of base vegetation type that exists in a given tile. So the Spanish did it pretty effectively with a lot of water lifting technology, and canats and vertical or diagonal, horizontal wells, right? Drilling in the mountains and things like that. Yeah, all kinds of ways to overcome that, but it's not as easy as just being able to farm an area with very little infrastructure. So, but anyway, yep. So is that any follow-up questions to that?
Yes.
All right, go ahead.
Well, so Arise spoke also. Should I speak or he?
Arise. You can go ahead and ask a question.
So will you see that on a larger scale, like with the RLC and perhaps even like bigger, such as like the formation of the Mediterranean?
Oh, can you elaborate a little bit more?
Like just changing water tables using human structures or whatever to create an ecological disaster, basically.
Right, or overusing. It's interesting. Like, it's probably a little harder without mechanized pumps to drain an aquifer or something like that. But it's actually something that would be interesting to research, because all through the Mediterranean you had bedrock types that were very favorable for drilling canats and other types of wells, or exploiting natural springs up in the mountains the way the Romans did. Right, you had you basically had a lot of more porous rock, aside from your sort of younger bedrock types. You had sedimentary limestones and stuff like that were really conducive to water flowing through it. And I'd be curious to what extent a lot of those wells were straight up exhausted due to over exploitation. I knew that some of the some of the Roman aquifers, like that were exploited, the aqueducts that they created, like degraded over time, and you had some situations where you once had a fantastic aqueduct that created this beautiful, sparkling, delicious water, and then it's gradually turned brown and kind of disgusting, and so they would divert it to farm fields or stuff like that because it's not something that you wanted for the urban public to be using. And so, but it was, that was, sometimes the quality could vary for a variety of reasons, and I'd be curious whether it was just like it got tapped dry or overutilized or something like that. I'd be curious to know. The Persians probably had tons of information about that because they had been doing it the longest, right? But it's a interesting question. I don't necessarily know the answer to that, but it's definitely something that would be more of a localized affair. You wouldn't be able to drill these horizontal wells as effectively in some cases as others. I would expect
if we could find the Farsi resources. I actually know a few people that speak the language, so
that'd be cool. Yeah, if we can get some cases of that happening. You would expect that a lot of your mountaintop springs and aquifers would be the ones most likely to be overexploited, right? But to some extent, I would imagine, my suspicion is you would basically probably you would deplete it to a certain baseline level to which it would then recharge. You would enter into an equilibrium where it would kind of recharge at the same rate that you're draining it, and then no amount of extra drilling would get you that much more because you'd effectively probably tapped it out at a certain level. Because it's still going to rain, there's still going to be water going into the porous bedrock, and that may or may not have answered your question, Erez, but hopefully that was something.
Well, I have a follow-up question too. He mentioned, Vagrant Hero mentioned the Romans planting trees in North Africa, and that reminded me of what the elves in the game are supposed to be interested in doing and creating forests. And you frequently mention depletion of resources, a depletion of soil organics or an aquifer or something. But what about the elves trying to build it up and make it more intense? Would that run with the same mechanics?
Yeah. So, and that goes for. So, I would say that would basically be kind of the objective of elves would be to do what a lot of the ancient Amazonians did, which was to actually build up superior soils and superior soil depth. Here's an interesting story. Actually, my dad's actually has been he was like president of the Rare Fruit Council for years and years, where he would collect rare seeds from all over the world and grow these exotic. We're down in Florida, so we could grow all these exotic tropical fruit trees, and no one else in the state could really grow any of these fruit trees because the soil here in Florida kind of sucks. It's acidic. You really have to do a lot of stuff to it to improve it. But on his property, over about the course of 40 years, he's built up the soil to be thick and black and absolutely delicious for plants through just like years and years and decades and decades and decades of composting, adding organics, adding in. He lives in an equestrian community, so adds like all of this carbon into the soil in the form of like horse manure and stuff like that. And after doing that for 40 years, he has this very rich, loamy, organic rich soil, and then like everyone else's property around it is practically like semi-desert because it's sandy and it's acidic. And so in his yard, basically fruit trees are growing 4 or 5 times faster and producing 10 times more fruit than everyone else around them because he's effectively enriched the soil, even just over 4 decades, right? And so you would expect that this would be the kind of thing the elves would engage in too. And if you do it in a large enough scale, then you start influencing rainfall patterns and things like that, especially around rivers, right? Like most of the rain that's going to fall, if you don't have something absorbing it and pumping it back into the atmosphere, most of that rain is going to end up in the ocean and doesn't really get cycled through the area as well. And so the best way that you can capture that water and then pump it up into the atmosphere locally to improve rainfall patterns is with something with deep roots and something that needs a good bit of water, like broadleaf trees, right? And so if you can get your trees growing thick enough, and this was something that was already pretty much mostly programmed into the vegetation model, if you get thick enough trees, tall enough trees, enough biomass in a tile, then almost no water is able to escape by the time you get to the ocean. It all just gets cycled in the atmosphere in the local area, which then further makes the area better for for elvish lifestyle, right, or agriculture in general. So yeah, that's does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, yes.
If I may interject, one of the advantages of doing things with simulated systems is that if we want to give elves an option to enrich their soils, we don't really need to write a specific event like you would in Cloud Sandwich Engine just for that specific purpose, because all those elements already interact with each other. So we only need to modify a single variable for all those cascading effects to take place.
Yeah, and that's what's cool. So it's not like you have to create some kind of elf plugin type of situation. Like all you're really doing is just having them, interact slightly with the system. So like, okay, we're gonna chop down less trees, and we're gonna spend this much effort, just like cultivating the trees that we want, which then you just plug into the vegetation growth model, right? It just becomes a multiplier to the tree's success, right? And there's no need to make any other kind of unique system for that purpose. But yeah, right now the way organics works is basically anytime a plant dies or is destroyed by some cause and isn't removed, then whatever its mass was decomposes and is added to the soil, and different plant types have different baseline growth rates, and so things like grasses will grow very, very quickly, even though they don't grow particularly tall and they have deep roots and everything. And so the more that grass is able to grow in a certain area, the more organics it ends up adding to the soil. And scrubland with shrubs tends to be for its mass not particularly fast growing, and doesn't tend to produce too many organics in the soil. And trees tend to be better than shrubs, broadleafs especially, since they tend to produce larger leaves and lose them more often. Pretty good with soil organics. Conifers less so. And so that's how we handle organics currently. And organics will actually, like I said before, it's kind of like money in the bank, organic material, in the sense that there's a finite amount of it. And if you want to conduct agriculture in a given area, when you move on to virgin land, there's a lot of organics still in the soil that you can tap immediately. But if you farm the way that most humans have throughout history, then you can exhaust that organic material pretty quickly if you don't start replacing it. And so yeah, then the land starts to degrade over time. Anything else?
Well, I guess I'll have to break the silence once again.
Go ahead.
So I had a question a couple weeks ago for Calandiel. During one of my streams, I noticed there was a heat wave over a glacier, and I was wondering whether that increased glacial melts. And I couldn't quite tell during my stream. Calandiel said, yeah, it should. And my question for you is, are you certain that's what happens? And also, that made me think, could there be, at some point in the future, the capability in songs for glaciers to shrink or perhaps even grow?
Yeah, it's funny because ever since I started working on snow, I was like, oh man, I know such a better way to deal with glaciers. I would do a lot of things differently at this point. Yeah, glacial melt should be sped up by increased temperature during that given season. But right now, yeah, it's unfortunate because if I had done things differently, I could have just had snow kind of accumulating on top of an area, compressing. And the best way to have handled it, I think, would have been to not have ice and snow, but just have, snow mass or something like that. And then some areas just, you can see, right, when we turn on the season, some areas end up with way more permanent or semi-permanent snow even in some places. And so we could have just probably tuned the model to deal with it that way. Yeah, that kind of thing is trickier because when you're dealing with, one of the reasons we were really dealing with that we simulated glaciers to begin with was to be able to simulate the effect that long-term glaciers have on soil in the surrounding area, right, and the production of glacial loess. And so, like, if we wanted to plug the current snow model to account for permanent glaciers in the future, then we'd have to kind of retune how we handle dispersal of silts and stuff like that. And so it gets a little more complicated. And so it's like, all right, we're back to what do we want to get stuck doing? Like, how long do we want to put off gameplay, right?
Yeah, and with regards to that first part of the question, I'd have to double check, but I'm like 90% sure that heat waves impact glacial melt. Because if I recall, glacial melt just calls the get temperature function, and that thing includes heat waves in the equation.
Yep. Yeah, I guess where the model is lacking right now is that it's sort of like treated like free water in a way, right? So you get extra melt, but it's like it doesn't technically come off the glacier, right? It should reduce the size of the glacier if you have extra heat at that given moment, and so that's kind of where the model is flawed. And snow is definitely influenced. Snow melt is absolutely positively influenced by temperatures at that given moment.
Yeah,
that's for sure. That's why I wish I would have just relied on a snow model in the beginning. Yeah, and there's actually a number of things that go into snow melt, right? Aside from just the temperature of the surface, right? There's kind of there's a soil temperature factor as well, depending on characteristics of the soil or the landscape, or if there's exposed bedrock and stuff like that. And that all influences the rate at which snow melts. And so, yeah, it's not just a uniform melt pattern. So it should vary every time. All right, next question, anyone? You got another one? Let's see, who hasn't talked in a while? Who do we want to put on the spot? How about a typical name?
Questions, huh? So how far have we gone since last time? Like, I noticed your little tooltip said flora and fauna. Do we have animals yet?
Animals are a bit tricky because we want to represent some animals with specific separate objects that we call herds. But we don't really want to wait with gameplay until we have those, because even though they are important, do we really need to put the development on hold for another 2-3 months just so we can chase bisons?
Depends on what kind of gameplay you're showing. Like, if we're going to be hunter-gatherer societies, the things to hunt are going to be kind of important, right?
Well, yes, but actually most hunter-gatherers didn't hunt big herds from what I've read in literature. So I think we can infer a lot of information from vegetation patterns for that specific purpose. If that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, fair enough.
Got some red hills there. Vagrant, you got anything for us?
Yes. Alex, one of the people in the Twitch chat asked to make the other speakers look better.
Yeah, we can start talking about sort of like strategy session, future songs, direction, stuff like that too. That's sort of what the second half of the meeting was supposed to be about as well. And that kind of typical name has been hinting at that subject for a while, because things have obviously been slower since COVID, and so Calandial and I and some of the other people that are close in the project, we've been talking about how to create a resilient strategy for Songs of the Aeons long term, and try to keep things moving even when we're in slow periods like this, and how to integrate it into our lives in a sustainable way, because this year has definitely been very challenging. I guess I can probably start just running everybody through it right now. Basically, as everybody knows, we have a global pandemic on right now, and what's been very difficult for me is, I'd taken a new job that was really great and made my life better in a lot of ways. It's permanent remote, and so I don't have to go out to the office or anything like that. But I have my two daughters. And my eldest daughter has a pretty severe lung disease and can't breathe very well, and so we've basically been in complete lockdown mode. I haven't been anywhere. I think I've been out to maybe 2 public places in about a year. And downside of that, of course, is that we can't send our kids to school, which means they're here all the time. Someone's got to be watching them and homeschooling them. And so it's been really difficult sort of having that extra 6 hours taken out of each day, to educate our kids and keep tabs on them and work our day jobs and try to keep things moving with Songs of the Aeons. And so, so that's been very difficult for me. And at times I've had periods where I've been able to, it's been kind of like I'll spend 2 weeks to a month kind of working more intensely on something. It's been harder to keep up with streams, but like there was a period where I went ahead and, worked on vegetation, and then had to kind of step away for a bit and then come back for another 2 weeks to a month to create the new real color map mode, step away for a bit, come back, deal with, create some the snow model and soil moisture model and things like that. But it's been difficult getting into the kind of rhythm, sort of daily rhythm that's necessary to move things ahead really aggressively and effectively. And so, it gets me down a little bit, to be honest, at times, because I really do miss like the daily getting on the stream and having people to talk to about these things, and taking long walks and thinking about the things I'm working on in songs, and listening to lectures on different fields of science so I can integrate it into Songs of the Aeons model and stuff like that. It's gotten me down a little bit, that I haven't really been able to live Songs of the Aeons the way that I had before. And so, I don't know. I'm just hoping cases go down, and I'm hoping I can get my kids vaccinated not too far into the future, although right now it's not looking super hopeful. And so, I just find it necessary to tell people, like, I don't really know when things are going to get easier, because I don't know when I can get my kids back in school. The good news is, with my new job, everything is pretty stable at this point, and I'm doing really well at my work. At times, there's even periods, the times that I've been able to work on songs are periods where things are slow at work, and I can spend, a week or two without even really having to do a whole lot with work other than meetings and things like that. And so that's gotten easier. The question is how to, at what point things are gonna get back to something resembling normal. Also, just in my own life, like, my wife and I were about to settle down with our family in a permanent home. Right now, we're kind of just living in a townhouse, waiting for the moment that we kind of settle someplace permanently, and that's just like all been put on hold, and so it feels like my life is at this liminal stage where we're trying to get settled permanently, and that's not very conducive to a project like this either, right? And so, yeah, it's tricky getting into a groove again with all the stuff that's going on. But yeah, that's my situation, and so in my head, it's a matter of how do you just keep things. How do you keep things alive? How do you maintain some kind of development habit where you just don't get too far out of the habits you'd built as far as around development? Like I said earlier, from 2017 2019, there was like this rhythm every single day, or at least 5 days a week. Sit down. You have 6 hours to work on songs, and so there's always the next thing you were going to work on today, and so you always had something on the bench in your head that you were going to start coding. And it's really kind of sad because I've learned so much since then and could do so much more with that kind of stability than even I did before, since I was learning back then. But yeah, it's a question of when that's going to happen. And so yeah. Anyone have any questions involving the challenges of developing and dealing with chaos in the world? Anything? Anyone? Do I dip?
Jerry, come on.
Let me check this.
Well, so all my questions are related to ecology, actually. I'm not here to talk about songs that Eons not its development.
He has nothing on pandemics, I guess.
Yeah.
Pandemics, I guess.
Yeah, we did a pandemic. We did a pandemic episode, didn't we? I'll make the speaker louder, please. Sorry. Are you guys talking about forest fires and animal grazings? Yeah, well, we can still talk about ecology. Yeah, the big thing that wasn't implemented when it came to ecology. There's kind of right now biomes kind of, they settle into kind of like an equilibrium, and you end up with different biomes in different places. But we're really currently still don't have the large scale disturbance components that we were hoping for. And to be honest, I'm kind of, with the development of vegetation, like, I originally sort of worked it all out in Python, and and then it was way too unsteady and unwieldy, and you would have these cataclysmic forest fires that would just burn every single living thing to death in a given tile, and so I realized that the big issue with the ecology model was actually an issue with how we were dealing with water, right? In real ecosystems, all your plants are getting water from the soil, which acts as a reservoir, right? And we're not talking about aquifers necessarily. We're talking about literal soil moisture, right? And so, right, you can see soil moisture here. This is where plants actually drink, right? And then they deplete that as they drink it. And so if you have a dry season, plants can live off of the banked water that was in the wet season. And if you have, for instance, loamy soil that retains water well, then you can actually have a nice forest in an area with extreme climates, wet, dry. But if you have sandy soils, then the wetness doesn't stay in the soil very well, and then you have these annual forest fires and stuff like that. But without soil moisture in the model, it ended up just burning everything down. So I went back and then added in soil moisture, and then put in some code for future aquifers. And basically, water falls on the lands, and then it's absorbed by the soil. Some of it runs off toward the ocean, and then the banks of rivers can get a little extra soil moisture, and that's where plants actually get their water, and it stabilizes the vegetation model substantially, right? Yeah, there's still a number of things that I'd like to do with the vegetation model. Mainly, I was thinking about. It sounds like it'll take more time than it really will, but rewriting the vegetation model to better account for the changes that occurred with the soil moisture code, and make it so that plants are actively competing with each other and able to snuff each other out, and take into account sort of heighten the effects that different niches have within a given tile, so that you always have at least a little bit of each vegetation type in an area. But yeah, that's some of the background information about ecology, and grazing animals. Originally, what I really wanted with grazing animals is for their success in a given area to be contingent on sort of like every grassland isn't made equal, right? Some grasslands will have much faster growth, and so therefore be able to sustain a much larger carrying capacity of animals and things like that. And I wanted to be able to capture that particular dynamic, right? And in forests, forests tend to kind of like the food is harder to get to. It's higher off the ground. It doesn't quite grow back as quickly. And so you don't have as much biomass of animals in forests, so you can't. There's sort of not as much protein walking around, and but you can still you can graze animals just about anywhere. But from a civilized perspective, if you're an agrarian people, but grasslands, especially are great because they grow back so quickly, and so you can move your herds over them, mow it all down, and then boom, it grows back very, very fast, depending on the grassland that you're dealing with.
Well, I, a few weeks ago, once again was talking to Calandiel on the Discord server, and we were talking about ocean ecology and how kelp forests, theoretically, should also grow and shrink, kind of like forests on land. And Calandiel said, yeah, that'd be nice, but of course, developing that would require quite a lot of time and it would delay gameplay even more. So my question is, I guess, at what point do you want to develop ocean ecology? Is that going to be put on the back burner until land gameplay is settled?
Yeah, I mean, so it's one of those unique situations where ocean ecology is reasonably divorced from land ecology, so it's one of those things that we can put off without influencing higher systems as much. And there's all kinds of ecology you want to consider for the ocean that even influences coastal civilizations. It's not just kelp forests, but you're dealing with things like oyster reefs, coral reefs, anything that would sustain fisheries and things like that. And so, yeah, that is fairly important. But the good news is, if it's left to be for a while, it's not a big deal, because it's not like we're building too many systems on top of it right now that would need it. Interesting tidbit. My background is in marine biology, right? So this subject is near and dear to my heart. But what to give you an example of land ecology not necessarily being super connected to nearby ocean ecology, you can go to a desert limestone islands in the Caribbean, like Curacao, and you'll be walking around on land and see you have all these thorny desert plants, and there's very little primary production, and not a heck of a lot of life when you're walking around these little craggy islands. But then you go just, maybe 2 meters into the water, and just boom, explosion of life, just loaded with some of the most, some of the biggest amounts of diversity and primary production anywhere on Earth, right? So it's A, not something we have to worry about as far as layering anything on top of it, but B, in the future is still important because you can imagine the situation. So like this looks like a little limestone peninsula too, with some coral reefs around it. You can imagine a situation where you have an area of land that is relatively desolate, but then its surrounding ocean subsidizes anyone that would be living in that area because you have, tons of oysters and tons of clam and fisheries and crab and things that you can live off of, right? That would kind of create positive living conditions in an area that wouldn't otherwise sustain it, right? So it's definitely important. And I also want sentient cuttlefish too at some point in the game, so.
I second the motion with the sentient cuttlefish.
Wait, thirded.
I don't know.
Hey, as you're scrolling over the map. Oh, sorry. What was that?
I was just making a joke there. The Tongarad stealth combo is pretty good.
As you're sort of scrolling over the map, I noticed. I don't think I've ever seen an alluvial fan in Sons of the Ends.
Yep, it's been
modeled them?
Yes, they have been modeled, and at one point they were in, and they were pretty cool. But it was just put on ice for a bit. So the way it currently works is, so we're tracking the amount of sediment that goes down a river, and depending on how fast the river is by the time it gets to the coast, and how much sediment is in it, you'll actually end up. Oh, you mean alluvial fan? I thought you meant like river deltas. Alluvial fans. You mean like off a mountain or something like that?
No. Alluvial fans is like the Nile River Delta where it's
okay.
Or like probably a better example is like the Tigris and the Euphrates,
right?
Where they create a whole sort of a whole marshland before the actual delta.
Right. Yeah, and that's. I mean, this is. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's part of the delta issue that I was talking about before, where it was modeled. We had them for a while. They had issues, and we kind of disabled them for a bit. But the conditions for determining whether one forms or not, like they're in there, and should, when we get back around to it, creates procedurally generated results that reflect. So if you have a big giant freaking river that's moving tons and tons of material, you'll end up with a big freaking fan depending. So this area would produce a massive fan that would go out. A giant delta that these might even merge, because you can see there's continental shelf here. So the sediment piles up. It doesn't just get dumped off of a trench or something. Yeah, right. And so you would see that, and you would probably see it back up here, and this would all be wetlands, and then you would have your fan, right? And some of them could get very, very big, like Bangladesh. Whereas anything that's going directly off of a mountain, the water is super fast, and so just boom, it flushes everything straight out into the ocean. You don't have that same fan effect, and you have less sediment. So that's how the physics of it worked, right? But yeah, like I said, it's been disabled for now. But one of the reasons I'm really looking forward to reintroducing it is the implications in the future are pretty significant, because wetland agriculture is big, obviously, but even before wetland agriculture, like, there was a kind of semi-hunter-gatherer type of existence that people lived in those wetland situations. The Nile River Delta used to be like this wild lands where you'd go out and hunt alligator and all kinds of exotic stuff for exotic goods, and it wasn't until a bit later, from my understanding, that it was really conquered for the purposes of agriculture. And so you can almost imagine, in game, like, you would have to put quite a bit of effort toward taming these kinds of wetlands and turning them into arable lands. Not to mention it'd be ever more dangerous with lots of swamp adapted monsters and stuff like that.
Sounds amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's
So there would still be benefits to leaving them untamed.
You could, yeah, sure, totally. And I mean, it's wetlands. Yeah, they serve all kinds of interesting roles as far as ecosystem services are concerned too. And not to mention, you could imagine like some kind of species that adapts to river deltas and wetlands differently than humans, which is typically like, all right, drain it and then plant a bunch of shit, All right, we got anything else?
Well, there is one problem that's been it's been 0.2 in the test builds for a while, and it's the problem of conifers avoiding high elevations. The conifers seem to not quite grow where they're supposed to. Is that? Are you aware of that?
Yep.
Yeah, we are. That's where Damon needs to update the model of nature, because we figured that 0.2 has been in development for so long that it's really time to move forward. So the current ecology model was created by finishing the existing plant code. So it has some of the persistent issues of the original plant code.
Yep. I mean, yeah, the thing is, like, so much had been added since the official last major release that it was like, okay, it's time to release something.
If you look at the roadmap, I think 0.2 is like twice the size of 0.1 and 0.0 combined.
Yeah, so from and also, from the perspective of like, of people that don't super closely follow the project and might just like download it off of itch.io, right? Like, there's a lot to be there's a lot of good arguments to just like say, okay, so this is a good 0.2, let's go ahead and release it and work off of that.
There's also the problem of, Damon, as he said, he's not working as well as often as he used to, but I still am. And in order for me to keep working on the game, I need to have the information necessary to create new game systems. So
yeah, and we're planning between Cal and I to basically fork the repo, so that Cal can work on gameplay mechanics independently of me sort of messing around with stuff, and shifting the baseline. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of.
And then we would merge those together and have the best of both worlds, so to speak.
Yep. And so what I'll probably do in the future is I'll probably rig up another Pythonic model and revisit some of that, revisit the model and try to make it work the way I intended it to. And that would basically be the foundation for any kind of animal development too. But I really, I need, for me, for where I am in my life right now, like, I need something that I can work on affirmatively to make progress with without being in burnout mode where, there's an immense amount of pressure to kind of, to create larger systems that take a lot of focus and a lot of thought and a lot of engagement, because until things settle down, it's going to be a bit too difficult for me. And so revisiting something like vegetation and getting it right, that's a lot easier for me.
I assume that also includes the ever elusive evapotranspiration.
there's a variable just sitting there right now in the model that I believe hasn't actually been plugged into the atmosphere, but will be as soon as I know that vegetation is right. But yeah, we'll see. I vegetation has been about as frustrating for me as water flow had been way back when. Anyone that was watching the streams back in the day, like 2018 or something, when I was first working on water flow, like this is when I was, able to put a lot more time into the project. Where like every single day I was trying to deal with water flow and failing and just slamming my head against the wall, not knowing how I could do it, because I was running the erosion model and the water flow model at the same time to sort of create natural features. I was trying to fill indentations in the land and stuff like that, and create and destroy water bodies as erosion patterns were shifting and stuff. And it was torture. And sometimes things don't work out the first time you do them, or even the second time you do them. But water flow, we pretty much got it. I mean, I'm really happy with it now. It's doing all the things that it should do. It could always be better, especially now with soil moisture and snow and ice and seasonal water flow and everything like that. It's pretty. If I could tell myself back then how it would end up turning out, I'd feel a lot better. But I remember at the time just being like, "This is impossible. This is an impossible thing to do. We cannot. This is not possible. I should just give up." And so I suspect vegetation is gonna end up like that as well, where I'll finally find the correct way to do it, and then everything will fall into place. The original time I wrote the vegetation model was without soil moisture, and so it's like I have all of these artifacts of the old model that didn't exist on a foundation that was solid, and so it's like, okay, just take what I've learned, rewrite it, and see how that goes. One thing that's kind of interesting, by the way, is when we started Songs of the Eons, like I wasn't an IT person, I'd never worked in the industry or anything like that, and I assumed that that Songs of the Eons was kind of like Little League, right? Like where when I got into actual IT, everything was going to be so much more complex and harder and everything like that. But now, after officially spending over a year in IT, I'm like, oh wait, no, Songs of the Eons is a million times more complicated than anything I'm working on at work. And in a way, I kind of miss it too, because it challenges you a lot more. And when you're working for a big corporation, like you spend 90% of your day dealing with red tape, and 10% of your day actually coding. And with Songs of the Eons, it's just like create. It's this fluid kind of thing. You can talk to everybody about what you're creating. You can show everyone what you're creating. There's no secrecy or anything like that. And I definitely miss not being able to do that as much. It's kind of a cool area here. But so let's see, what do we got back over here? What disease does your daughter have? She has something called chronic lung disease. She was a micropreemie when she was born, and so her lungs weren't working, and so they had to put her on a ventilator for months because she couldn't breathe on her own. And the ventilator itself permanently damaged her lung tissues, and so there's all this scarring. Some of it's fixed over time just from her growing, but it never quite healed, right? And so it's like she's effectively like a really bad smoker almost. Gets winded easily and things like that, along with some autoimmune issues. So good news though is I've gotten to play some great video games with my kids since we're all stuck inside. Anything else from our High Council gallery?
Well, I mean, I don't want to talk over anybody else.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
We only have one question left. We've gone through all of my questions except for the one. And it is kind of appropriate also as the last question. So what is the plan for the immediate future? What are the first gameplay systems you plan to start tinkering with in the next couple of weeks?
So I assume that's a question for me.
Yes.
Well, the first thing would be getting people to spawn again in the world. If you remember the update from the beginning of 2020, we had those small hunter-gatherer tribes moving around, and there was some preliminary logic for that. So I'll be enabling that, and I'll be giving people an option to control those tribes so that they move around and can migrate to better places with better food access and such. But yeah, it's a bit difficult to talk about it because it will all kind of come together at the same time, and I'll need to experiment a bit on Discord to figure out the best way to, design UI for it. Because I can't really think of any hunter-gatherer simulation on the market. So I'm not exactly sure what's the best way to, create user experience for this particular type of gameplay. If that makes sense.
Sure, yeah. I was just curious. What was on the table?
But yeah, I think on the roadmap, I think I updated it, and we basically focused on hunter-gatherers. Late Stone Age before agriculture, getting those people to move around, giving the player an ability to create clans and eventually settle down so that they can research agriculture and, leave the rest of the history.
All right. Anyone got anything else? We got some sand dunes here.
Question about animal domestication, but that seems to be kind of far out in the future right now.
Yeah. I mean, animal domestication really in a lot of ways enables lifestyles that wouldn't otherwise exist in a lot of places, right? So you could imagine a situation where scrubland doesn't have a heck of a lot of promise for a society trying to live there. Can't really do much agriculture unless you have an immediate water source that you can kind of irrigate off of. But you could probably herd goats just fine because they're perfectly happy to graze on scrubland, right? You have a lot of this actually in certain arid portions of North Africa. The hinterlands of Mesopotamia too, away from the rivers. You had herders that could their animals could survive on kind of land that you couldn't conduct agriculture on, and so that also really influences the kind of animals that you're able to domesticate in a given area will greatly influence the social dynamics, like political dynamics that you would see as well, versus of the settled people farming the floodplains versus the agrarian people, pastoral people moving around, with their herds and occasionally deciding that perhaps they have more to gain from taking things from the settled people as opposed to just trading. The very first priority, of course, is just to have the wild animals moving around, influencing the landscape itself, right? Because whether you end up with trees in a place that's currently a grassland can depend on whether anything is grazing there at a given time and in what magnitude. And so having actual herds of animals move around in a given area and kind of reach into the nooks and crannies of a different place bump into obstacles and things like that, I think will influence the way the actual biome map itself looks, right? So let's say you have, a dense forest right here, and you have a grassland, forest through here, a grassland on this side, a grassland on this side. You could have a situation where grazing animals might kind of locally go extinct, or at least most species of large grazing animals of grasslands go extinct here, and then forest is allowed to encroach because they're no longer munching up all of the saplings of the forest that's trying to encroach in this area, right? So it's really what I wanted to be able to achieve with animals long term with the wild animal model, is to be able to have alternative stable steady states in a given area, at least partly due to the way that animals behave and move around and things like that. And then domestication, you domesticate off of whatever particular animals you might have around in an area, and then they tend to then enable different types of lifestyles as well as different types of industry or warfare and things like that. Everyone knows, right, the effect that horses and beasts of burden have on warfare, right? Especially like logistically, being able to move armies farther and more effectively with draft animals. Alright, so let's see. Will ecology eventually allow for the rare climates, Mediterranean, continental, to appear? Ideally, right? Like, the Mediterranean's kind of interesting because, and we've talked about it before, right? Where you have, Mediterranean scrublands, which are kind of the hinterlands of your farming areas, oftentimes along fertile river valleys. What's really interesting about the Mediterranean is you have a history of repeated seasonal dry periods, which tends to make the soil oftentimes a bit more fertile as far as mineral nutrients there. And so if you can just irrigate that drier kind of land, then you end up with some pretty nice farmland around wherever your water happens to be. So vegetation will kind of play a role in that as well, as far as Mediterranean type climates are concerned. So I mean, the vegetation should reflect the climate, and vice versa. Like I've told the story before about when the Mediterranean along the coast was significantly more forested and you had more rainfall as a result, and then deforestation gradually led to more arid conditions. All right, so we're about an hour and 10 minutes in. Does anyone have any final thoughts or final questions before we wrap up the meeting?
I'm spent.
We'll just hope that the pandemic modifier ends and we can resume our lives normally, right?
Yeah, goodness, wouldn't that be nice? And for just me to get settled permanently. Because I know the best time for me in the development of Songs of the Aeons was when I was in a reliable rhythm from day to day. I knew what to expect tomorrow. Wasn't juggling too many balls necessarily. So, yep. Got anything else to say, Calandial, before we depart? Fearless co-leader.
Well, let's hope we'll play this game by the end of the year.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you next time, and see you in the community.
Yeah.